Hello everyone, welcome to our next lesson in graphing. We're going to look at making a bar graph from some data that we've collected. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through kind of all the steps piece by piece and talk about some of the important things when we are making a bar graph from data that we have collected. So the first slide I'm showing you here is answers to the question, how many siblings do you have? So when we're collecting data, we're often starting with a questions or a series of questions. That could be like a survey, for example. And in this example, we're going to be working with this question. How many siblings do you have in a class of 18 students? So you can see the names here, and then beside are their answers. So for example, Elise has 0 siblings, Sandra has 1 sibling, etc. Okay, we've got all the answers to all the questions, right? So this could be maybe where we start. We've asked the question, we've collected the answers, so now we need to start to organize this data. Okay, so one way we might do this, we looked at last time, was in a table, right? This is obviously a much more organized way to present the data than this, right? Here it's really hard to see. So to make my table, all I did was I set up the different categories. So I looked at people who had 0 siblings, 1 sibling, 2 siblings, and 3 siblings, right? Because those were the answers here. Nobody had more than 3, right? There's a 3 here. There was a 3 here, right? And so I was able to set up my different columns. So, for example, I can see here really quickly that there are 6, 6, 4, and 2. So I have my data now in a table, but I want to present it as a bar graph. So in order to do this, I first set up my axes. So I've got my vertical axis and I've got my horizontal axis. I used a ruler, right? And I'm going to be attaching a piece of grid paper if you'd like to use for making your graphs, which I would highly recommend. It's a lot easier to use when you have all the little squares for making your bars and that. You can make your graph look really nice. For my example, I didn't use grid paper. I just used a blank piece of paper. So I got my ruler and I carefully drew out my vertical axis and my horizontal axis. Okay? Now, the next step is the most important step. There's a lot of important things that are going on here. Okay, so first of all, I had to choose, was I going to make a vertical bar graph or a horizontal bar graph? It's entirely your choice. In my case, I decided to go vertical. I'm going to do my bars vertically. But if you want to do a horizontal bar graph, that is totally fine. That's your choice. Okay, and you can see that I've set up a number of things. First of all, I put my title. I decided to go with the title of number of siblings in class. So I felt like that was a title that described the data that I'm showing, right? I'm showing the number of siblings that students in the class have, right? Then I decided on my axes, on my vertical axis, my horizontal axis, what were the titles that were going to go there, and what am I going to be showing on those different axes? So I wanted to go vertical with the number of students who had these number of siblings. I wanted to put that on the vertical axis. Okay, and this can be a confusing part of the graph. I myself had to really think, like, so what's that going to look like, right? So it might be worth doing like a little sketch. Like I might go off to the side and just sketch, okay, so it's going to look like this. I want the bars to go this way. So what does that mean I have to put here? I'm going to think about that maybe in like a rough draft. And then once I have that really clear in my head, I got that really clear idea, then I can go and put it on my graph. Okay? So I decided to go with those categories here, right, which we saw if I go back to this slide, right, my 0 siblings, 1 sibling, 2 sibling, and 3 siblings, right, those are my different categories, 0, 1, 2, 3, number of siblings, and then number of students in each of those categories is going to be here with the scale. Now, when you're creating your bar graph, the scale is super, super important, and that's another good reason to use the grid papers. You can have your scale be very even. In my case, I just kind of had to measure it out and made sure that my scale was consistent, right? The space between 1 and 2 should be the same as the space between 2 and 3, 3 and 4, etc. So my graph is uniform. Okay. And also with your scale, notice I'm using ones here. I'm counting by ones. You can count by twos, by fives, by tens, like we talked about last time, right? But you're always keeping in mind the data. So if we go back again, the numbers here again were 6, right? 6, 4, and 2. So if I'm looking at those numbers, right, I could actually count by twos. I can see there 2, 4, and 6 there, right? But what's important here in the scale is I'm not going to go from 1 to 50, for example. I could go maybe from 1 to 10. That might be all right. But I'm going to keep my scale in relation to the data I'm showing. I know that my maximum number I'm going to be showing is 6. So I've got that there, so I can have a nice graph. If I did a really small scale, like for example 1, 2, 3, 4, right? 5, 6, and I'm going to have these tiny little bars, which makes the graph hard to read. So that's something to consider. Okay, so I've set up my titles. I've got my axes ready, my scale. I'm ready to graph. The next thing I did was simply to draw in the bars. So I know that my numbers were 6 for 0 siblings, 6 for 1 sibling, 4 for 2 siblings, and 2 for 3 siblings. I drew those bars in nice and neat with a ruler, and I was ready to go. My last step was I wanted to add some color to make my graph a little more presentable. I would really recommend this. It really makes it nicer to look at, right? Colored in my different bars here, different colors, so I had a really nice looking graph. Okay, so those are the steps. That's how I went from here, right, where I was asking my question. I had my raw data, we could call it, where I had just the answers to the questions. I moved it to a table, so it was easier to work with. Then I started to put my graph together, and I ended up with a nice way to present my data. Okay, so important things. Certainly use the grid paper if you can, right? If you have a printer to print that off and use that, wonderful. Certainly use a ruler, right? You can see with a ruler it makes it look much better than just trying to freehand. Okay, and I am going to be sending you the data that I would like you to graph. Take your time with it. Remember my suggestion back here to work through a quick little rough copy so that any mistakes you make, you can see and say, oh, you know what, I'm going to make my scale this big, and I'm going to make sure that I have this on this axis and this on this axis, right? Work through that a little bit so we don't make any big mistakes in our good copies. And I really look forward to seeing your graphs. We'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.